The day my father decided to divide his properties started like any other family gathering, loud, crowded, and filled with the kind of forced laughter that usually hides tension. It was a chilly Sunday afternoon when my dad called all of us to his house. My older brother Mark arrived first, confident as always, wearing that smug smile that suggested he already knew he'd get the best share. My sister Claire came next with her husband, whispering excitedly about the lake house they were sure would become theirs. I arrived last, not because I didn't care, but because I already had a feeling about how things would go. In our family, I had always been the responsible one, the one who helped my dad with errands, paperwork, and repairs whenever he needed it. But somehow, responsibility never seemed to come with rewards. My father sat in his favorite armchair in the center of the living room, holding a stack of folders. His expression was playful, almost amused, like he was preparing to tell a joke. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once. "Let's get this over with." Mark leaned forward eagerly. My dad opened the first folder. "Mark, you'll be getting the downtown apartment." Mark grinned widely. I knew it. Claire clapped for him, though I noticed the small flicker of jealousy in her eyes. Dad opened the second folder. "Claire, the lake house will be yours." Claire gasped dramatically and hugged her husband. "Oh my God, Dad, thank you." Everyone seemed happy. Everyone except me, because my father still hadn't looked in my direction. Finally, he picked up the last folder. Instead of reading immediately, he chuckled to himself. That chuckle made my stomach twist. "Well," he said slowly, "that leaves one more property." Mark leaned back on the couch, already smiling like he knew something funny was coming. Dad pulled out an old, yellowed paper and waved it in the air. "You get the country house." For a moment the room was completely silent. Then Mark burst out laughing. Not a polite laugh, a real, loud, uncontrollable one. "You mean that broken shack in the middle of nowhere?" he said between breaths. Claire covered her mouth, trying not to laugh but failing miserably. "Oh wow," she said. "I forgot that place even existed." My dad leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Well," he said with a grin, "it's still property." More laughter. I sat there quietly, forcing a small smile even though my chest felt tight. The country house, everyone in the family knew about it. Dad had bought it decades ago when he briefly dreamed of turning it into a vacation retreat. But the dream died quickly, and the house had been abandoned ever since. The roof leaked, the paint peeled off the walls. The land around it had turned into wild weeds. It wasn't just old. It was practically falling apart. Mark wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Hey," he said, nudging me with his elbow, "maybe you can charge ghost tours." Claire added, "or sell the wood for firewood." Even Dad laughed again. "Come on," he said, patting my shoulder. "Don't look so serious. At least you got something. Something." The word echoed in my head. For years I had helped him with everything. I drove him to appointments when he didn't feel like driving. I handled paperwork for his rental properties. I even helped renovate the apartment Mark was now proudly claiming as his. And now this was my share, a broken house nobody wanted. The gathering ended shortly after that. Mark and Claire kept celebrating their good luck, while I quietly took the small rusted key my father handed me. As I headed for the door, Dad called out behind me, "Hey." I turned around. He tossed the key toward me with a grin. Good luck with the ruins. More laughter filled the room. I caught the key and slipped it into my pocket without saying anything. But as I stepped outside into the cold evening air, the laughter followed me all the way to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the key in my hand. Maybe they were right. Maybe the country house was worthless. But something inside me refused to believe that. As I started the engine and drove toward the countryside to see the place for the first time, one quiet thought stayed in my mind. They all thought it was a joke. One day they would realize it wasn't. The first time I drove out to the country house, I almost understood why everyone laughed. The road leading there was narrow and cracked, surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly into the distance. Tall grass brushed against my car as I followed the dirt path that my father had once described to me years ago. When the house finally appeared, it looked even worse than I imagined. The wooden gate hung sideways, barely attached to its hinges. The yard was covered in weeds that reached almost to my knees. The paint on the walls had faded into a dull gray, peeling away like old skin. And the roof, well, the roof looked like it had survived one storm too many. I parked the car and sat there quietly for a moment. So this is it, I muttered to myself, the joke, inheritance. When I stepped out of the car, the wind rustled through the tall grass around me. The place felt strangely quiet, like it had been waiting for someone to return after many years of abandonment. I walked slowly toward the front door. The wooden porch creaked under my weight, and when I pushed the door open, it groaned loudly as if complaining about being disturbed. Inside, dust filled the air. The furniture was old and covered with white sheets. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the ceiling. The wooden floor creaked with every step I took. At first glance, it truly did look hopeless, but then I noticed something unexpected. The structure of the house was still strong. The support beams were thick and solid. The foundation felt steady beneath my feet. Even the walls, though cracked in places, didn't seem beyond repair. I walked from room to room, slowly exploring. The living room had a large stone fireplace that must have once been beautiful. The kitchen was outdated but spacious. Upstairs, the bedrooms had tall windows that overlooked rolling green hills. And the view, I stepped onto the small balcony and froze. The countryside stretched endlessly before me. Trees swayed gently in the distance, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was peaceful, far more peaceful than the noisy city streets where my brother's apartment stood. In that moment, a strange realization hit me. The house wasn't worthless, it was simply unfinished. All it needed was time, patience, and someone willing to believe it could become something better. Someone like me. I sat on the dusty porch that evening and started making a plan. The first step was obvious. The roof had to be repaired before the next heavy rain. After that, I would clean the yard, replace the broken windows, and fix the floors. It wouldn't be easy, and it definitely wouldn't be cheap, but something inside me felt determined. If my father thought this place was a joke, then I would turn that joke into something worth laughing about for an entirely different reason. The following months became the hardest and most rewarding months of my life. Every weekend I drove out to the country house with tools in the trunk of my car. Sometimes I worked alone for hours, hammering boards, cleaning debris, and slowly bringing the old place back to life. At first, progress was slow, but little by little, things started to change. The weeds disappeared from the yard. The broken gate was replaced with a new wooden one. I patched holes in the walls and reinforced the roof. Each improvement made the house feel less like a ruin and more like a home. Meanwhile, my family never stopped making fun of it. At Sunday dinners, Mark would smirk and ask, "So how's the haunted mansion coming along?" Claire would giggle and say, "Have the ghosts started paying rent yet?" Even my father joined in. "Careful," he joked one night. "If you fix it too much, someone might actually want to live there." Everyone laughed. Everyone except me, because while they were laughing, I was working. And with every nail, I hammered into those old wooden boards. The house slowly transformed into something they could no longer imagine. They thought I was wasting my time, but deep down I had a strange feeling about that old country house. A feeling that someday it would prove them all wrong. By the time the second year of renovations began, the country house barely resembled the broken place my father had handed me. The roof had been completely replaced with sturdy red metal panels that shined in the sunlight. Fresh paint covered the once peeling walls. The garden I planted in the yard had begun to bloom with flowers and small fruit trees. The house that everyone once mocked now looked warm and welcoming. But there was still plenty of work left to do. One Saturday morning, I decided to repair the back wall of the house. The wood panels there had rotted over time, likely from years of rain leaking through the roof. I grabbed my tools and started removing the damaged boards one by one. The process was slow. Nails had rusted into the wood, making each piece stubborn and difficult to pull out. After about an hour of work, I pried loose another panel. That's when something unusual caught my eye. Behind the wooden boards, hidden deep inside the wall, was a small metal surface reflecting the light from my flashlight. I frowned. "That's strange," I muttered. Carefully, I removed a few more pieces of wood until the object became fully visible. It was a small metal box, old and slightly rusted, but clearly placed there on purpose. My curiosity instantly replaced my exhaustion. Who would hide a metal box inside the wall of a house like this? I carefully pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. For a moment I hesitated, staring at it. Then I slowly opened the lid. Inside were several folded papers, yellowed with age but still surprisingly well preserved. I sat down on the dusty floor and began unfolding them. The first few documents looked like property records. Old maps and handwritten notes marked sections of the surrounding land. But one paper immediately caught my attention. It was a detailed map of the entire property, and right near the center, directly beneath the house, someone had circled an area in red ink. Next to the circle were two words written clearly. Natural spring. I stared at the words, confused. A natural spring. Under the house, I flipped through the other documents quickly. Some contained geological notes, others appeared to be reports from decades ago describing underground water sources in the area. Apparently, many years before my father bought the land, someone had discovered that a clean underground spring ran beneath the property. The information looked important, but I had no idea how valuable it actually was, so the following week I decided to take the documents into town. There was a small office run by a land specialist named Mr. Henderson. He had helped many local farmers evaluate their properties over the years. When I placed the old documents on his desk, he adjusted his glasses and began reading carefully. At first his expression remained neutral. Then his eyebrows slowly rose. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "They were hidden inside the wall of my house," I replied. He looked up at me, clearly surprised. "Your house sits on this land?" I nodded. He leaned back in his chair and tapped the map with his finger. "Do you realize what this means?" I shook my head. Mr. Henderson stood up and walked to a large map hanging on his office wall. "This entire region," he explained, "has struggled with clean groundwater for years. Natural springs like this are extremely rare around here." He turned back toward me. "If this spring is still active, your land could be very valuable." "How valuable?" I asked. He gave a small whistle. "Well, companies pay a lot for reliable natural water sources." My heart began beating faster all this time. He continued, "You might have been sitting on something far more valuable than just an old house." I left his office that afternoon with my mind racing. The broken country house my father had laughed about, the one everyone in my family called worthless, might actually be sitting on something incredibly valuable. But I didn't tell my family, not yet. Instead, I drove back to the country house, parked in the driveway, and looked at the building I had spent 2 years repairing. The sunset glowed behind the hills, casting long shadows across the garden. For the first time since my father handed me that rusty key, I allowed myself to smile, because slowly, piece by piece, the joke he gave me was turning into something very serious. 2 years after my father handed me the rusty key to the worthless country house, I decided it was finally time for my family to see what had become of their favorite joke. For months I had been finishing the last touches on the house. The walls were freshly painted, the wooden floors polished, and the porch I built stretched proudly across the front of the house. Flower beds surrounded the walkway, and warm yellow lights glowed from the windows at night. The place that once looked abandoned now felt alive. But the biggest change wasn't just the house itself, it was what lay beneath it. After speaking with Mr. Henderson, I had quietly worked with a small geological survey team. They confirmed what the old documents had suggested: the natural spring beneath the property was not only active but incredibly pure. Soon after, word spread to a few companies that specialized in natural spring water. One of them made an offer, a very large offer. large enough to completely change my life, but before making any final decisions, I wanted my family to see the house one more time. So I called them all. "Why don't you come visit the country house this weekend?" I said casually during our usual Sunday call. There was a short silence, then Mark laughed. Why, did it finally collapse? Claire giggled in the background. Even my dad chuckled. "Well," he said jokingly, "I suppose we should check if the ruins are still standing." I simply replied, "Just come see it." Saturday afternoon, 3 cars slowly pulled into the driveway. I stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing as they stepped out. At first, none of them spoke. Mark was the first to react. He looked from the house to the garden, then back to the house again. "Wait," he said slowly. "This isn't the same place." Claire walked a few steps closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It looks beautiful." The cracked walls were gone. The roof shined in the sunlight. The garden was full of bright flowers and neatly trimmed grass. Even the crooked gate had been replaced with a strong wooden entrance. My father stepped forward last. He stared at the house quietly for a long moment. This is the country house?" he asked. I nodded. "After 2 years of work, yes." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "I thought you were just fixing it a little," he said. "Not turning it into something like this." I invited them inside. The living room, once covered in dust and cobwebs, now looked warm and welcoming. The stone fireplace had been restored. Sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the hills. Claire slowly turned in a circle. "It looks like something from a magazine," she said, but I could tell my father was thinking about something else. He walked quietly from room to room, examining everything carefully. Finally, we all stepped outside onto the porch. The evening sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. That's when I decided to tell them the rest. "There's something else about this property," I said calmly. They all looked at me. I pulled out a folder and handed it to my father. Inside were copies of the geological reports and the offer letter from the water company. He read silently for nearly a minute. Then his expression slowly changed, his eyes widened. "You're telling me," he said quietly, "there's a natural spring under this land?" "Yes." "And a company wants to buy it?" "Yes." He flipped to the last page again. The number written there was large enough to make anyone pause. Mark leaned closer to look. "Wait, that offer is worth more than the apartment and the lake house combined." Claire looked stunned. For the first time in years, no one laughed. My father slowly lowered the papers and looked out across the peaceful hills surrounding the house. "The same house he once called a joke, I guess," he said quietly. "I underestimated what this place could become." Then he looked at me. "No," he corrected himself softly, "I underestimated you." I simply leaned against the railing and smiled. Because the best revenge isn't yelling. It isn't anger, it's success. And in that quiet moment on the porch, the laughter that once followed me everywhere had finally disappeared. Now the only sound left was the wind moving gently through the trees surrounding the house that everyone once believed was worthless.